I don't know about you, but as of recent, most of my brain rot sessions have resulted in video after video promoting various bands and concerts from within the hardcore scene. This is, of course, in between my regularly scheduled schizo posts. This suggests that right now, hardcore is more popular than it's ever been, with bands like Knocked Loose, Turnstile, and Kublai Khan forefronting much of the discussion regarding alternative music online and completely overshadowing the new and alt metal trends of the past few years. It got me thinking, how is hardcore a genre and scene that only 10 years ago was defined by a group of overweight, bold white men in hate-breed snapbacks and madball hoodies, viciously gatekeeping the sound into a few specific bands, become the favourite genre of trend-hopping TikTok freakazoids that were forced to throw out all their Deftones hoodies 6 months ago and are now more than happy to step into a breakdown in a Tsunami t-shirt within their bedroom and posting it on their Instagram story. Hardcore has seen insane development throughout the past decade or so. The introduction of the internet has evolved a genre that consisted primarily of beatdown and metalcore bands with a lineup that looked like your average Breaking Bad side characters to a scene that's incredibly diverse both visually and audibly. The genre is as accessible as it's ever been, resulting in both positives and negatives for the health of the scene. But how did we get to this point? How can two bands with incredibly different sounds and images be placed within the same genre, and why do local shows smell so bad? The name hardcore originally comes from hardcore punk, which is a genre that first saw development in the early 1980s. Various bands within the United States began revolting against the commercialization and watering down of punk within the UK at the time, which itself was a genre that had morphed from minimalistic garage rock offshoot intended to rebel against corporate takeover into a subculture and style of music that was receiving heavy commercialization and mainstream backing. In turn, the next generation of punks decided to rebel against this commercialization by making the music even more aggressive, fast, and of course, difficult to listen to. This resulted in various issues in terms of distribution for early bands, with pioneers such as Black Flag being dropped from their label for being anti-parent. This resulted in the creation of the independent label SST by Black Flag guitarist Greg Ginn, starting a trend of DIY hardcore bands who would deal with everything from production to promotion. This lack of traditional label infrastructure also inspired much of the culture surrounding hardcore concerts in the modern day. The band Minor Threat was fronted by hardcore legend Ian MacKaye, who at an early age decided to abstain from any drugs or alcohol, writing a song about it named Straight Edge. This inspired many others within the scene, leading to various bands booking all ages shows within venues that didn't have bars. As you'd imagine, most of these venues were extremely scuffed, ranging from basketball courts to warehouses, with many not having traditional stages. This perfectly fit the ethos and culture, as the bands were able to perform on a level playing field to the audience members. Not one group was presented as better than the others, unless you were straight edge of course. Those motherfuckers claim to be better than anyone who may be drinking a goddamn stubby at a show. Although much of hardcore's negative reputation in the following decades was based on the scene housing a group of people that all looked the same, it didn't present itself as such from the get-go. In 1977, a jazz fusion band named Mind Power was introduced to punk rock for the first time and immediately switched their name to Bad Brains, deciding to partake in a little bit of hardcore. Upon entering the punk scene, they saw much of the lyricism as vulgar and overtly negative and began to disdain this. Inspired by reggae and the Rastafarian movement, Bad Brains decided to introduce what they labelled as a positive mental attitude into the music, which involved being socially conscious and positive to everyone apart from gay people, of course. A few Bad Brains members were inspired by the more so negative aspects of Rastafarianism. The band continued to evolve their sound, introducing elements of funk and aspects of various heavy metal subgenres, proving that hardcore didn't just consist of one sound. The band would relocate to New York in 1980, which traditionally is a more socially conscious city than Washington, D.C. Various bands within the city would follow in the footsteps of Bad Brains' positive attitude, introducing lyricism that focused more so on self-improvement than shouting about eating vegetables or viciously assaulting politicians. These bands included Gorilla Biscuits and Cro-Mags, who created the perfect environment for any disenfranchised individuals in search of a crowd for their own. Hardcore quickly became more than just a style of music. Many of their fans revolved their lives around the songs and culture that surrounded them. The violent concerts became a release, an opportunity to experience a style of music with like-minded open-minded and welcoming individuals. The music within the New York scene would continue to develop, introducing elements traditionally seen in more extreme metal genres, such as palm muting and in some cases growled vocals. This laid the groundwork for what would eventually become beatdown hardcore. The development of beatdown alongside the introduction of more metal elements into hardcore resulted in metalcore and metallic hardcore, which pushed forwards one of the most important aspects contributing to the popularity of modern hardcore, a section of music so short and easily recognizable it's almost ergonomically designed for a TikTok or Instagram reel, the breakdown. Although breakdowns had existed in music for decades before the development of
hardcore
and traditionally presented themselves in completely different ways depending on the genre, the chuggy, palm-muted, drum-heavy breakdown that we all know and love today first saw development within thrash metal in the 80s, specifically through the band Slayer. The song Rain in Blood utilized single-note chugging-style guitar alongside prominent percussion to create what is commonly labeled today as the breakdown. This technique was eventually utilized heavily by prominent early metalcore bands such as Converge and Earth Crisis. Metal was continuing to creep its way into hardcore throughout the 80s, with bands like Agnostic Front,
Suicidal
Tendencies and Cro-Mags taking influence from the more thrash metal style of riffing into their hardcore music, influencing crossover thrash. As the music began to evolve, so did the attitude and culture surrounding the scene. The late 80s would specifically introduce a tough guy attitude, herd mentality, and in some cases gang culture that plagued the scene for many years. The development of this culture stems back to the very beginning of the style of music, with the introduction of what is known as crews. Due to the aggressive nature of early hardcore music, it began to attract an overtly negative crowd. This came in the form of demonetized German political party skinheads who would raid the shows, throw up demonetized hand salutes, and take pride in beating the shit out of anyone who opposed their twisted way of thinking. This led to many prominent bands such as Black Flag, Youth of Today, and Judge forming what they called youth crews to fight against the racism plaguing the scene, whilst promoting straight-edge culture, veganism, and community-driven values. This inspired what would become known as crews, which became both a positive and negative trend within the hardcore scene for decades. Prominent examples include the Boston Crew, formed by the straight-edge band SSD, who would forbid alcohol and drugs at their shows and often resort to violence as a result. Another Boston-based crew named Friends Stand United or F Shit Up would become infamous within the scene, originally forming to utilize violence in an attempt to kick drug dealers and racist skinheads out of the scene's concerts, and eventually resorting to criminal activity such as extortion and in some cases extremely scuffed hardcore related territory warfare. Despite hardcore originally being a subculture designed for outsiders and misfits, much of its culture does stem from violence, with many of the mosh moves being designed to fight against racists within the scene, which is extremely funny because I can't think of a less effective way to fight off racists than a fucking spin kick. As soon as herd mentality starts getting involved within a scene, the original purpose behind the subculture begins to become diluted. The scene becomes much less welcoming than it once was, and rules on who can or can't partake begins to seep into the culture. This began to plague hardcore, gatekeeping was rife, and the genre slowly became less accessible. As the 90s rolled around, hardcore began to receive a negative reputation amongst many other scenes. On the surface, they were seen as antagonistic, violent, and unwilling to share their culture with anyone who they may see as unworthy. Fights between subcultures became common at shows. In some cases, this was simply unfortunate, as greasy metalheads would become extremely confused after seeing a bold man in normal clothing attacking crowd members, leading to them getting involved without realizing it was completely normal for the scene. In other cases, it was more intentional, like in the case of the New England Hardcore and Metal Festival Brawl in 2000, which saw AXCX fans clash with the band Hatebreed and some of their fans. The late 90s also saw disagreements within the scene in terms of what hardcore was supposed to be sonically, with bands beginning to play a more traditional style of hardcore to protest against the metallic style that was being played by many of the more popular bands such as Hatebreed. Whilst hardcore was violently scrabbling in the background, other aspects and subgenres of punk music was beginning to explode into the mainstream in the late 90s. The style of punk pioneered by the early hardcore band Descendants, known as pop punk, was leading the charge in terms of countercultural music, leading to the more melodic variants of hardcore seeing some real mainstream attention. This of course shot the subgenre into various different subgenres, with a flurry flurry of bands attempting to insert themselves into hardcore and punk scenes in hopes of receiving some of that monster energy money, or perhaps receiving the honor of being plastered all over a prominent MySpace page ran by this motherfucker. This culture began to fade in the mainstream, as it always does, with more die-hard hardcore lifers forming bands and emerging from the depths of obscurity. Bands like Touche Amore and Title Fight paid respect to the genre and scene, whilst developing the sound into new directions and presenting a style of performance that was more appealing to a wide audience than just buff tattooed white guys in bandanas. This came around the birth of prominent internet culture, which truly changed hardcore's reach in terms of a potential audience. At this point in time, hardcore was truly built off of the people who had dedicated their life to the scene and culture surrounding it, which of course resulted in healthy secular scenes. But that was the problem. The scenes were secular and only available to those who lived near or were somehow subjected to it naturally in person. Don't get me wrong, there was still magazines and music videos that somewhat promoted hardcore to a mass audience, but it was 100% more difficult to enter a scene unless it was prominent in your particular city or you just started one yourself. The internet changed this. Bands and artists were able to network online, marketing DIY shows to those who would appreciate it the most. This in turn led to a thriving underground scene. The shows were full of new kids, records were selling, but there was just one problem. Nobody within the mainstream paid any attention, perhaps still burnt by the continuous crash out of countercultural revivals in the early 2000s. The emergence of streaming made it even harder for these bands financially, resulting in beloved bands like Death Eater and Title Fight breaking up, which is incredibly ironic considering the insane popularity TikTok has gifted these bands in the modern day. It was also around this time that the iconic hardcore band Trapped Under Ice would splinter into various side projects, with one of the band's drummers, Brendan Yates, forming the band Turnstile. We'll get back to these trendy motherfuckers with their trendy haircuts and skateboards and trendy goddamn clothing later in the video. Although traditionally hardcore and heavy metal subcultures didn't really get along, with the overtly edgy nature of metal and socio-politically charged nature of hardcore often resulting in immediate backlash and resentment from sections of the scene if a hardcore band veered towards metal, the turn of the millennium saw musicians take their varied influences and combine them in a way that seemed natural in terms of progression for the genre. This wave of metalcore that started in the late 90s and early 2000s with bands like Converge and Botch would inspire hardcore kids that would form bands in the 2010s. The band Code Orange, previously known as Code Orange Kids and nowadays known as a Nickelback tribute band, would specifically cause huge amounts of noise within the scene with the release of their project I Am King, introducing more elements of metal and electronica into their music. This project cemented a new direction for hardcore, a direction that would sonically appeal to a much larger audience. Metalcore has since become a vital aspect of hardcore, with many of the most popular bands utilizing aspects of extreme metal in the modern day. The bands are able to utilize a new sound and image that appeals to a younger generation whilst still portraying the fun and universally appealing aspects of the previous hardcore, such as crowd participation and spin-kicking e-girls for fun. Although the introduction of metal elements is an extremely important factor in the popularity of modern hardcore, the band that first spearheaded this modern spurt into the mainstream have actually embraced the poppier side, whilst still staying true to the genre that made their sound possible. Turnstile originally emerged from the Baltimore hardcore scene in 2010 and became one of the biggest names in alternative music through the release of their newest album Glow On in 2021. This album not only resulted in continuous hardcore related discussion within mainstream publications, but also a greater discussion on who and what can even be considered hardcore in the modern day. Although Turnstile's brighter and more optimistic musical style doesn't immediately scream hardcore if you compare it to Marauder or some shit, it's become increasingly difficult to define what hardcore actually is. Motherfuckers who look like this will claim that hardcore died after that one band who played 2 shows and sold 3 cassettes broke up in 2004, whilst this motherfucker will label genres that sonically range from pop punk to slam metal to jangle pop as hardcore. Hardcore in the modern day is more than just its sound. It can be a certain message, ethos, but most importantly, it's defined by involvement in the scene. Regardless of a band's particular sound, their roots in a scene that has continued to push forwards aspects of its rich history, promoting a healthy DIY culture, can truly be considered hardcore in my eyes and in the eyes of many people currently within the scene. Turnstile's sound strays away from the more niche aspects of hardcore, pushing the band towards real mainstream success, stretching as far as huge headlining tours, festival appearances, and even Grammy nominations. This may raise a few questions. How can a genre like hardcore ever be mainstream? Surely its identity is built off of counterculture and success outside of the mainstream, which is a valid point, although Turnstile still have close ties to the more underground aspect of the community and still play shows that resemble hardcore concerts whilst reaping the rewards of the years they spent in the underground working hard on their craft. Turnstile have been incredibly important to the health and growth of the scene due to their insane crossover appeal. You'll see the resident Nails t-shirt wearing concert attendee enjoying the music just as much as the e-girl draped in as many Hello Kitty logos as feasibly possible. Hardcore was always about creating a space and community for those on the fringes of culture, and Turnstile have been able to do so by taking a genre and scene that has been historically viewed as incredibly antagonistic and made it accessible to literally everyone. In the years since the release of Glow On, hardcore has continued to explode in popularity and mainstream attention, with one of the main bands assisting this differing to Turnstile in terms of their sound, intensity, and heaviness of their music. Knocked Loose would form in 2013 out of the Louisville hardcore scene, with the band collectively deciding to put all of their efforts into music after the release and subsequent success of their first EP, Pop Culture, in 2014. The band combines elements of metallic, classic, and beatdown hardcore, creating a sound that is unrelenting and intense. The band have actually claimed that they have been forced to remain heavy due to the fact that frontman Brian Garris can't actually sing cleanly, instead choosing to shriek like an over-the-top Tom and Jerry moment. This inability to produce clean vocals have led Knocked Loose down a path of unrelenting noise and an unwillingness to dampen their sound regardless of the success they may receive. This has been extremely beneficial to the band as their popularity built off of well-received releases and the virality of the Arf Arf meme have led them to heights never seen by a hardcore band as heavy as Knocked Loose. In 2023, the band were invited to perform at Coachella. Although immediately agreeing, the band assumed that the concert would go terribly due to an assumption that a festival like Coachella would be unlikely to allow a typical hardcore performance and crowd. This wasn't the case at all, as upon arriving, the band saw that the barrier was down in a typical hardcore fashion. After assuming it was a mistake, they met with a staff member who wanted to encourage the style of music and culture Knocked Loose had been championing for years, taking hardcore from community halls to Coachella with as little watering down as possible. Even since 2023, Knocked Loose have remained ridiculously heavy with the release of their newest project, and I know half of you motherfuckers are going to comment how Knocked Loose aren't heavy and I should be promoting Guttural Slug or some shit, but to the average mainstream listener, they are likely heavier than anything they've heard in the past, although still remain appealing enough to receive attention from these listeners, perhaps signaling a change in what mainstream music fans are willing to listen to. Despite the success, the band have remained humble and completely avoided straying away from the sound and scene that made them popular. Of course, as is common in literally any heavy band that received large amounts of attention, Knocked Loose have had their fair share of detractors, which is absolutely fine if these detractors are simply just criticizing the music, but from what I've seen, it's more so a group of hardcore lifers that believe a hardcore band should never be as big as Knocked Loose, and Knocked Loose can't be considered hardcore due to this success. They came out of hardcore, received a ridiculous amount of success staying true to hardcore whilst never watering down the sound, and still argue with security at huge venues about barricades. Knocked Loose proves that hardcore doesn't need to deviate into pop elements to push into the mainstream, with the band potentially having a brighter future than even the likes of the more mainstream friendly Turnstile. Even with Knocked Loose's aggressive sound, the scene is still ripe with fat white men in mad bull setted off hoodies who crowd kill anyone wearing Turnstile merch. This loud minority is becoming drowned out by the new generation, however, a generation that is open to a wide range of sounds and styles within hardcore. If we look back towards the poppier side of hardcore, we can look towards Military Gun, one of the first bands within the hardcore scene that was signed to a major label after the booming success of Turnstile. Military Gun are commonly considered hardcore by the vast majority of the community, although utilize a more power pop approach as opposed to the typical classic hardcore hardcore or even beatdown. Frontman Ian Shelton utilized his various influences in conjunction with hardcore. He saw a gap in what hardcore bands were utilizing in their sound and filled it. Military Gun and Turnstile's overwhelming acceptance into the scene may seem surprising considering the genre's gatekeeping reputation, although it makes complete sense. Bad Brains were originally a funk band, Black Flag made f***ing sludge metal, Husker Du laid the groundworks for alternative rock and grunge, Refused used techno beats, and Fugazi made everything apart from traditional hardcore. The open-minded sentiment is beginning to spread throughout the scene, with the amount of dickheads drastically reducing. Luckily, these people can be ignored, because even the goth e-girls can look just straight over the 5'2" heads of most gatekeepers. On the topic of e-girls, hardcore has traditionally remained bitchless, with even the most eloquent of spin kickers unable to crowd kill their way into any form of coochie. This has also changed due to the introduction of prominent new bands such as Scowl, Gel, Gouge Away, Fleshwater and Pest Control, who all differ sonically but bring the same hardcore energy, as well as featuring prominent female singers who still somehow have a deeper tone than Brian Garris from Knocked Loose. Although that has absolutely nothing to do with coochie and that previous yap was simply just a joke. Prominent female singers in the scene makes the music more diverse. The attitude and subject matter appeals to a wider range of people, with the concerts attracting more people from different backgrounds. There are even figures within the scene that are essentially considered hardcore royalty that are beginning to push forwards their sound sonically into new directions that wouldn't typically be considered hardcore. A prime example is Justice Tripp. The frontman of Trapped Under Ice in the 2000s has since formed a band named Angel Dust, whose name parodies 80s shredders and style reflects an attempt to play indie rock as fast as possible, combining jangly pop production with hardcore riffs. It's a similar story for current Fiddlehead frontman Pat Flynn, who has evolved from the straight-edge hardcore band Have Heart into Fiddlehead, which commonly utilizes alt-rock and emo stylings, embracing the evolution in hardcore. These two examples prove that even the most beloved individuals within hardcore are welcoming of change and willing to do it themselves. There was clearly a hunger for more, with this hunger leading to a more accessible genre and therefore a more welcoming scene. This consistent evolution into new styles hasn't left the traditional stylings in the dust, however. There are still bands performing classic genres such as Beatdown with Tsunami and Pain of Truth, crossover thrash with Drain and Pest Control, and even classic hardcore with bands like Gel. So based on my 20 minutes of yapping so far, you'd assume that hardcore's emergence into the mainstream is entirely based on the genre evolving into new sounds and becoming more accessible for a wider range of people, but that doesn't tell the entire story. Bands in the 2010s were consistently taking the genre into new directions with a little mainstream attention. Some of these bands have even seen a similar explosion into the mainstream despite being on hiatus for years, such as Title Fight. I believe the reason the genre is seeing popularity today is based more so on the state of culture and society as a whole, and by that I mean the fact that society is well and truly cooked. The media consistently takes full advantage of any problem the world may be experiencing by sensationalizing it to push some sort of agenda or receive more clicks. This in turn terrifies the general population, especially disenfranchised younger people who may not fit into any form of group and receive the comfort and validation this gives them. They are continuously told everything is and often forced for the internet for social validation and communication. Don't get me wrong, media sensationalization has always existed, but the internet makes it much more prevalent and easily accessible. People are left without a group or any form of mainstream culture to identify with, which signifies the point in which social media aids the current explosion in hardcore. Hardcore shows are traditionally mental. It's something that's integral to the scene and also extremely eye-catching on social media. Hardcore differs from most scenes, however, in the fact that it can't really be experienced through just listening to the music on headphones or reposting songs to your story. You can only gain a full understanding by attending one of the many shows. Whether the show be played within a basketball court or a stadium with a hardcore band being the support act for a more mainstream metal band, the same attitude, mood and ethos is presented. It in turn presents the most appealing aspect of the style of music, an aspect that is able to support the bands financially more so than just streaming the music. Concerts allow the bands to sell merch and present newer bands to an already present audience through support acts. The efforts the members of the community put in to keep the scene alive and thriving throughout the periods where the music wasn't financially viable in the slightest allowed for these shows to continue to happen. People online want visceral experiences, and if that comes in the form of an 120k kilogram straight edge male diving headfirst in your general direction, so be it. Although hardcore has always intended to be an inclusive community, welcoming of any individual from any background, it hasn't always presented itself as such. Its aggressive nature, alongside the fact that painfully sober white supremacists began to storm various hardcore shows in the 80s, which in turn attracted other individuals within the scene to fight back, made it unapproachable for anyone who may not fit into that specific demographic or have that specific dog in them. Nowadays, the scene is incredibly diverse, not just musically but visually too. Individuals from every background, race and gender are creating music meant to be enjoyed by anyone and everyone. It even differs from the typical mainstream push for diversity, which often comes in the form of forced diversity within films that's conveniently edited out of the Chinese release. The diversity within hardcore isn't forced in the slightest. It's as natural and normal as a large city being a melting pot of different cultures and ideas. This cultural diversity encourages innovations with bands like Soul Glow and Zulu introducing elements of funk and jazz that you can spin kick to. Hardcore spaces even allow bands that play music completely outside of the genre of hardcore. Death and slam bands like Gatekeeping and Sanguisugabog commonly play hardcore venues and are welcomed with open arms, despite playing a style of music that would be immediately scoffed at by the typical hardcore gatekeeper in the late 90s and early 2000s. Despite hardcore continuing to make pushes to include and welcome everybody into the scene, it is an unfortunate fact that gatekeeping is still alive today, with the mere mention of justifiable facts such as Knocked Loose being the biggest hardcore band on the planet, resulting in a verbal assault from scruffy men wearing extremely tight hate-breed snapbacks. How many times have I made that joke now? Gatekeeping is present in pretty much any scene, especially those that sit within alternative or heavy music, but it's always been particularly bad in hardcore, with the common excuse being the importance of cred checking any newcomer, making it traditionally very difficult to enter the scene. Luckily, the internet makes information free and easily accessible, allowing for everyone to not only receive the relevant information that's vital to entering the scene and remaining respectful, but also have the ability to record music, create merch, start record labels, and become an active contributing member within the scene. Although this does pose a risk of the culture being diluted, although I do believe the positives outweigh the negatives, new ideas and styles are consistently introduced, with the genre being seen as a positive, diverse place as opposed to a concert you'd probably want to avoid unless you want to be jumped by a gang of drugless bald men for being a different colour. Despite my consistent tirade against gatekeeping on this channel, in the case of hardcore it can be seen as a contributing factor towards its insane popularity. People love being a part of a special exclusive club, with the prominence of scene and cultures that promote this becoming sparse due to the freedom of information on the internet. Hardcore still presents itself as a tight-knit community, and regardless of its popularity or flurries within the mainstream, will always stay this way due to a healthy sprinkling of gatekeeping, keeping people out who simply see it as a fashion statement or a forced personality trait. Hardcore continues to benefit from the culture and history that built it, with another contributing factor to its success being the insane work ethic seen by many of the bands within the scene. Hardcore bands tour all the time, and not just within DIY hardcore venues, but within festivals all over the world. Check the lineup for any festival that focuses on heavy or alternative music. You will see a plethora of bands from hardcore scenes in the lineup. It not only allows for the average festival goers who may not be aware of the scene to experience the crowd culture surrounding the genre, but keeps the bands within the collective consciousness of heavy music listeners. This all does pose one problem, however: the idea that the more commercially viable a subculture becomes, the more the message gets lost in translation. Hardcore is seen as a way of life for the vast majority of people involved, and the mainstream attention is only going to attract people that see it as a hobby, or more nihilistically something different, trendy and cool to base their personality off before swapping back to Arctic Monkeys. Luckily, the vast majority of prominent artists within the modern scene are just way too niche to see mainstream attention in the same way Taylor Swift or Harry Styles does. Knocked Loose or Turnstile can very likely play stadiums in the near future, but based off of the history of these bands and the genre as a whole, I find it unlikely that the scene will be diluted to the point where it becomes a problem. This motherfucker just will not allow it. Actually, scratch everything I just said. The sole reason hardcore is popular at the moment is because this dude did a goddamn flute breakdown, and it's clear to anyone that's even somewhat looked into music that flutes just equal popularity regardless of what you even do with the goddamn flute.